Welcome everyone to Dr. John Bedker's Leadership Podcast, the podcast focused on leadership. The episode will begin shortly. Thank you so much for tuning in. Enjoy the podcast.
Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Dr. John Bedker Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, John Bedker. Well, world leaders are gathered at the World Economic Forum. This is an annual meeting in Davos, Switzerland. And what a week it was to listen about leadership. An absolutely seminal opportunity, I believe, this week. I'm going to share with you two perspectives, one brief and one hopefully much more in-depth. The brief one will be on the President of the United States that spoke on Wednesday, the 21st of January. Touch on that one briefly because it is not an exemplar for leadership. I'll quote from some articles. I'll give you some data, some contextual background and framework to support that summative analysis. But then we'll spend some time on really what was an exemplar presentation by the Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney. He spoke for about 30 minutes. I certainly encourage everyone to find any number of outlets to listen to the full presentation. I'll read snippets of his presentation, but it's really worth spending some time. Go on YouTube, wherever you choose to go to listen to this speech. It is absolutely an exemplar on leadership. Okay, and so we begin. Trump's threats. Let's start with that. Against Greenland and his promise to hit Europe with high tariffs if governments there don't support his seizure of Greenland drove the U.S. stock market sharply downward yesterday. The Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped 870 points, 1.76%. The S&P 500 was down 2.06%, and the NASDAQ Composite fell 2.39%. The worst day for all three of these major averages. Wow. There's the beginning. There is the intro. Yesterday, Tom Fairless of the Wall Street Journal reported that contrary to Trump's repeated assertions, the U.S. consumers and importers, not foreign countries, are the ones who have paid for Trump's tariff war. The Kiel Institute for the World Economy, that's a German think tank, echoed the findings of Yale and Harvard Business School economists, confirming that American consumers and importers have absorbed 96% of the cost of Trump's tariffs. Spend a little more time on this, folks, but here's the leadership story. Pretty clear. Misinformation, disinformation, and frankly, not telling the truth are not hallmarks of leadership. They're quite the opposite. In order to have trust, to build trust, to maintain trust as a leader, is based upon trustworthy behavior. He constantly provides this misinformation, this disinformation, and uses these global statements like everyone knows, as it's perfectly clear. Phrases like that have you think that there's a collective understanding aligned with him, when in fact the data shows clearly that it's not. Again, quoting from the Kiel Institute, Yale and Harvard business economists all confirming that American consumers and importers have absorbed 96% of the cost of Trump's tariffs. So what he is saying, and he says it so emphatically, he says it so deftly, it almost makes you think that Well, clearly he must be stating factually. And, in fact, he's not. In The Atlantic, on January 18th, Robert Kagan wrote, quote, Americans are entering the most dangerous world they have known since World War II, end quote, and warned they are neither materially nor psychologically ready for this future. For 8 decades, they have inhabited the liberal international order shaped by America's predominant strength and have grown accustomed to the world operating in a certain way. European and Asian allies have cooperated with the U.S. on both defense and trade, while the power of those alliances has prevented serious challenges to that order. Global trade generally has been free. Oceans have been safe for travel, both by humans and container ships. Nuclear weapons have been limited by international agreement. Americans are so accustomed to this basically peaceful, prosperous, and open world that they tend to think that it's the normal state of international affairs, likely to continue indefinitely, Kagan writes in The Atlantic. They can't imagine an unraveling, much less what that unraveling will mean for them. So in Davos today, Canada's Prime Minister Carney told the world, quote, we are in the midst of a rupture. The rules-based international order is no longer an automatic route to prosperity and security, as the world's most powerful nations now use that system's economic integration to coerce other countries. In its place, Carney offered a different vision, that the, quote, world of fortresses made up of major powers with spheres of influence that Trump and Russia's President Vladimir Putin are trying to build. Think about that alliance, that coalition, Trump and Putin. If, in quotes again, middle powers, end quote, pursue a system he called variable geometry, he said they can rebalance the world and help solve global problems while still building strength at home. His vision is a version of the, quote, diplomatic variable geometry, end quote, of former U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. But Carney's vision decenters the U.S., noting that middle powers must work together to be at the table to avoid being on the menu. Now that quick comment got a little bit of a applause and laugh, but it's really true. Middle powers must work together to be at the table to avoid being on the menu. Under a system of variable geometry, countries can develop infrastructure and trade at home, strengthening their own nations while negotiating new international agreements, as Canada has done recently with China, Qatar, India, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, Thailand, the Philippines, Mercosur, a South American trade bloc made up of Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay, a range of nations. But for international affairs, variable geometry means creating international coalitions for different issues based on common values and interests. Coalitions that work issue by issue with partners who share enough common ground to act together. In some cases, this will be the vast majority of nations. What it's doing is creating a dense web of connections across trade, investment, culture, on which we can draw for future challenges and opportunities. Folks, this is at the heart of leadership. This is why the comments by the Prime Minister, Mark Carney, were so critical at Davos yesterday, because he speaks about the values propositions. He thinks about truth, about collectivism, things that are central, fundamental to the art and practice and execution of leadership. So, quote again, "We know the old order is not coming back," Carney said. "We shouldn't mourn it. Nostalgia is not a strategy. But we believe that from the fracture we can build something bigger, better, stronger, more just. This is the task of the middle powers, the countries that have the most to lose from a world of fortresses and the most to gain from genuine cooperation." Folks, this is an exemplar speech on leadership. I want to give attribution here. A lot of these quotes, I made clear where they came from. This article itself, though, comes from Heather Cox Richardson, from her Letters from an American, dated January 20th, 2026. Heather Cox Richardson really, I think, captured some of these important and central themes. Some of the data that I provided, as I always try to, I hopefully supports this analytically. Well, what we need to do, I think, though, is to go right to the speech by Prime Minister Mark Carney. I'll read part of it. Again, I encourage you to listen to it all. It is an exemplar on leadership, a seminal talk on leadership. So, he begins by stating, "We actively take on the world as it is." I like that. Think about that again, just to begin, right out of the box, about leadership. Okay. Here we go. "It's a pleasure," he says, "and a duty to be with you at this turning point for Canada and for the world." Again, think about that. The perspective. Not about him. No. To be with you at this turning point for his country and for our world. Today I'll talk to you about the rupture of the world order, the end of a nice story, and the beginning of a brutal reality, where geopolitics among the great powers is not subject to any constraints. But I also submit to you that other countries, particularly middle powers like Canada, are not powerless. They have the capacity to build a new order that embodies our values, like respect for human rights, sustainable development, solidarity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of states. The power of the less powerful begins with honesty. Folks, central core value of leadership is just that, honesty. What does he do? In his opening remarks, highlights that as a cornerstone. It seems that every day we're reminded that we live in an era of great power rivalry, that the rules-based order is fading, that the strong can do whatever they can, and the weak must suffer what they must. This aphorism of Thucydides is presented as inevitable, as the natural logic of international relations reasserting itself. And faced with this logic, there is a strong tendency for countries to go along, to get along, to accommodate, to avoid trouble, to hope that compliance will buy safety. It won't. So, what are the options? Well, in 1978, Czech dissident Václav Havel, later President Havel, wrote an essay called The Power of the Powerless. In it, he asked a simple question: how did the communist system sustain itself? And his answer began with a green grocer. Every morning, this shopkeeper placed a sign in his window, quote, "Workers of the world, unite," end quote. He doesn't believe it. No one does. But he places the sign anyway to avoid trouble, to signal compliance, to get along. And because every shopkeeper on every street does the same. Because of that, the system persists. Not through violence alone, but through the participation of ordinary people in rituals they privately know to be false. Havel claims this living within a lie. The system's power comes not from its truth, but from everyone's willingness to perform as if it were true, and its fragility comes from the same source. When even one person stops performing, when the green grocer removes his sign, the illusion begins to crack. Friends, it's time for companies and countries to take their signs down. For decades, countries like Canada prospered under what we called the rules-based international order. We joined its institutions. We praised its principles. We benefited from its predictability. And because of that, we could pursue values-based foreign policies under its protection. We knew the story of the international rules-based order was partially false, that the strongest would exempt themselves when convenient, that trade rules were enforced asymmetrically, and we knew that international law applied with varying rigor depending on the identity of the accused or the victim. So, this fiction was useful, and American hegemony in particular helped provide public goods, open sea lanes, a stable financial system, collective security, and support for frameworks to resolve disputes. So we placed the sign in the window. We participated in the rituals, and we largely avoided calling out the gaps between rhetoric and reality. This bargain no longer works. Think about today in Davos, President Trump speaking emphatically, clearly, deftly about things that simply were not true, were not factual. And as Prime Minister Carney is saying, that bargain no longer works. He says, we are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition. Over the past 2 decades, a series of crises in finance, health, energy, and geopolitics have laid bare the risks of extreme global integration. More recently, great powers have begun using economic integration as weapons, tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. You cannot live within the lie of mutual benefit through integration when integration becomes the source of subordination. The multilateral institutions on which middle powers have relied, things like the WTO, the United Nations, the COP, the very architecture of collective problem solving. All of these are under threat. And as a result, many countries are drawing the same conclusion, that they must develop greater strategic autonomy in energy, food, critical minerals, in finance, and in their supply chains. And this impulse is understandable. A country that cannot feed itself, fuel itself, or defend itself has few options. When the rules no longer protect you, you must protect yourself. But let's be clear, Carney says, about where this leads. A world of fortresses will be poor, more fragile, less sustainable. So, what you wind up with is a new world order by saying that the comments of Donald Trump about how everything needs to go his way is really subordinating everyone else to him. What the Prime Minister of Canada is saying is no. That is not in the collective best interest. That is not in the interest of our world. So, what do? This is one of the really seminal leadership parts, I think, of his speech about the case for middle powers acting together. Saying that if we follow the current order, where the mega companies, the mega countries control, and the others follow, Carney says this is not sovereignty. It's the performance of sovereignty while accepting subordination. In a world of great power rivalry, the countries in between have a choice: compete with each other for favor, or combine to create a third path with impact. We shouldn't allow the rise of hard power to blind us to the fact that the power of legitimacy, integrity, and rules will remain strong if we choose to wield them together. Which brings us back to Havel. What should it mean for middle powers to, quote, live the truth, end quote? First, it means reality. Stop invoking rules-based international order as though it still functions as advertised. Call it what it is: a system of intensifying great power rivalry where the most powerful pursue their interests using economic integration as a weapon of coercion. It means acting consistently, applying the same standards to allies and rivals. When middle powers criticize economic intimidation from one direction but stay silent when it comes from another, we are keeping the sign in the window. Folks, this speech goes on. I've only given you snippets. Again, I encourage everyone to please listen to the speech in total from Prime Minister Carney of Canada at Davos. It is really worth your time. It is a seminal leadership presentation. It talks about where we are, and not only in problem identification, but in problem solving, what to do and how to do it. This is what leaders do, folks, and why it is absolutely a seminal talk. So, quite a week in Davos. It was hugely exciting. More to come for sure, but I share this juxtaposition between the talk of President Trump today, full of inaccuracy, misinformation, disinformation, but saying it with such emphasis, and that everybody knows when in fact it is factually incorrect, in an attempt to subordinate others to his will. And then yesterday, Carney giving this seminal talk on collectivism, on values, on truth, and honesty. It really, really is worth comparing and contrasting the two. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really and truly appreciate it. Take care. We'll talk soon.
Thank you for tuning in to Dr. John Bedker's Leadership Podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please tell your friends, and, of course, please follow our podcast and subscribe. Thank you again for tuning in.